let me do a quick introduction of Charlie. Charlie is a member of the California Society. He's actually presented to us in the past, but central for our program today is he is a cartographer. And I learned through reading a couple of articles on Ken Burns' documentary, The American Revolution, that Charlie was very, very involved in that documentary in terms of actually providing some of the maps used. And if you've seen the documentary, you know maps are central to telling. Obviously, there were no videos during that day, there weren't photographs, and the maps are central to doing that. So Charlie provided some of the maps. He was also an advisor to the documentary on the accuracy of some of the maps. So I asked him if he would be willing to share a program about his involvement in the American Revolution, and maybe what it was like behind the scenes to work with Ken Burns and just what was involved. If you look at the credits, you'll see Charlie's name in the American Revolution. When you look at the credits next time, you'll see his name. So Charlie, we really appreciate your being here and particularly developing this presentation for us. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. We can see your slides just fine and we can hear you. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to present this, and from, I guess I would say my kind of reason for being really pleased to be here is that this was easily one of the most enjoyable projects I've ever worked on in my career, and getting to work with Ken Burns and Florentine Films and all of their staff was really the experience of a lifetime in terms of you know, having almost a captive audience who was very interested in the work I've done. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about my background, and then I'll get into how I ended up being found or introduced to Florentine Films, and then how we ended up putting together the maps that went into the films. So I ended up joining SAR more than 20 years ago now, and I'd gotten interested in my patriot ancestor, and I've written a series of books about him. His name is Isaac Frye, and he was a officer in the New Hampshire Continental Army. And I actually have one more book to do in the series, but I just published a third book 2 weeks ago, and I had wanted to understand where he went during the war, and because he went all over colonial America, it was really difficult for me to figure out what different places were and what was relative to what. And so I took advantage of my background as a cartographer and somebody who was designing and building cartographic functionality for geographic information systems, and began mapping where he went and what he did. And that started with this map. It's a map that I made in 2003, and it features the Battle of Breed's Hill. And my kind of earliest kind of experience with doing this kind of work happened then, where I wanted to figure out where my ancestor was in the battle. I mean, everybody in the family knew he was there, but that was the only thing they knew. And so I ended up figuring out that he was part of, it was, I have it here, Captain Josiah Crosby's company from the southern part of Hillsborough County in New Hampshire. And they had about 100 men, and they were sent into Charleston to fire on the British as they were marching up the side of Breed's Hill, going towards the redoubt where the bulk of the battle was fought. And it actually took me 3 years to figure that out, but I know the company was there, but I just didn't have any proof of it. And I eventually found in the New Hampshire archives there was a note saying that he had requested reimbursement for the loss of his coat during the battle. If you know the history of the battle, once these companies had gone into Charleston, the British didn't like being fired on from the side, and the cannons in Boston ended up firing on Charleston with hot grape shot and burned the town of Charleston, and caused my ancestor and the few hundred men that were with him to have to get out of Charleston, and they went on to cover the retreat during the battle. The idea of being able to do that led to this map, and I published it a couple of times as it got improved. The first time was about 2004, and then another time in 2008, after I'd gotten in touch with the National Historical Park staff, and then a number of people who were writing historical information about Boston, giving tours and so on. And they wanted the map as part of their interpretive tours. And this map gets into the details of what was in Boston, and it's an inventory of everything that had appeared. And in particular, what I was doing was taking the idea that if any building that I knew something about, I'd give it a number, and then I'd list all the buildings in one column in this map. But anything I named on the map also had a list, and what it did was that with each one of these things listed, I had a numbered source, and I was able to tell which maps that were published around that time that I used to put that item on the map. And so having this kind of scholarly basis to say, this map was used to, say that I knew the name of Crooked Lane or Lindell's Lane, or whatever feature is on the map, started showing me that geographic information systems, or GIS, was a great way to do the background research for scholarly historical projects. And then about 3 years ago, I got an email from a cartographer who I had met about 15 years ago, who had seen those maps, and he said, "Are you still working on this stuff?" Because I was hired by Florentine Films to help them find resources to make maps for their upcoming series. And I ended up meeting with one of the producers, Mike Welt was his name, and Mike and I got along really well. And within the first week, he had actually shown me how they had taken some of the data that I had done in that first map of Boston and turned it into this, or at least an early version of this map. So it was, pretty exciting just to see, Ken Burns and the talent that he is able to pull in to help make, feature-length movies and documentaries, and have them be using my work. So I was pretty well hooked at that point as to, yeah, sure, I'd love to help and figure out how to get some more maps into the series. This, as an example, was the map that was behind what I had done as the coastline for that map. And the point here is that I'm able to find, anytime I can find an example like this and have that turned into something like this, that's where, the idea of, history and manuscripts can, I think, play a big role in how we understand history once it's put into, something like a film that Ken Burns can do, or even presentations like what I'm doing now. So one of the things that happened almost as we were finishing up the films is PBS actually launched into what they called their largest kind of press tour that they had ever done to promote this film series. And I got a call from a journalist at The Atlantic following up on what turned into the article in the November issue of The Atlantic that Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David Smith had written, where they talked for about a quarter of the article about what was involved in making the maps and why they were doing them. And this journalist had actually taken a step back from what we were talking about and asked a much simpler question, which is, why didn't you just use a modern map? And it took us aback a little bit, because we'd already gotten to that point and kind of assumed it was obvious, but it isn't necessarily obvious to everybody. So one of the things you can do is look at a modern map of Brooklyn right now, and then try to imagine the American Revolution, and particularly the Battle of Brooklyn, taking place on this map, and it's just difficult. But there are other reasons. So one of them is that when we tell a historical narrative, we want the things that people at that time knew and could use as reference material in how they made their decisions to act. And that's what translated ultimately to the narratives that were created in the film. So another reason that we ended up realizing that we needed to make some new maps was that 18th century maps, and the one I have as a clip out on the right was a good example of this, is that they're just not that easy to approach given what today people know about reading maps. Maps were just different back then in the sense of what was expected by the map viewing public, which actually wasn't a very large percentage of people. Maps were expensive to make. They were also government documents, or maybe they were business documents that were designed to promote an idea that hadn't happened yet. And this is a good example of a number of things that made 18th century maps difficult. One of them is like to use the example of Nova Scotia, which was shown on this map, which was published in 1763. And the purpose of the map was to show the post-French and Indian War territory that the British Empire controlled. And part of it was to illustrate the different regions and use the terminology that British citizens, particularly the merchant class or and the ruling class, would have known about the New World and America. And they ended up kind of butchering some things that even then they knew better. Like, for instance, New Hampshire goes all the way to include territory that is today Vermont, and New York and New Hampshire, and the people living in that territory were all fighting to have a different government than what was actually going on, which there wasn't any government yet. And so this kind of I kind of think of as aspirational in terms of what was shown here. It takes hold, and it's difficult for anybody who's trying to find the shape of New Hampshire today and figure out where it is on this map for them to do that. Nova Scotia, I mentioned, is difficult because it didn't technically exist in the area that is today New Brunswick, but there were people in Nova Scotia who wanted that land, and they had some influence on the way this map was made. And this map also shows the big term here, Acadia, and this is the Acadians who hadn't yet been removed. They were French-speaking citizens now of the British Empire, and Great Britain citizens wanted that land. So by 1765, they were kicked out and ended up in Louisiana. But this gives you an idea that there's just not a kind of a simple snapshot in time concept going on in 18th century maps. And in fact, they typically had anywhere from a snapshot that included 75 to 100 years. Sometimes there were places that had fallen into ruins, but they're featured prominently on the map just because they're places that people know about, and nothing new had shown up in these places. So back to Brooklyn. So this is what we would look at today, and this is the best map of the time. It was actually made in 1781, and to give you an idea, this is a much less complicated geography in the sense that there's lots of farming. This map also shows the terrain. So if you go back at the street map looking design of today's Brooklyn, it looks nothing like what this looks like. And we use this map as our kind of principal guide to what this territory looked like for the Ken Burns series. And in particular, this is the basis that we told the story of the Battle of Brooklyn on. And there's a lot going on in today's Brooklyn that just wasn't there in colonial times, like all the landfill for JFK Airport. So if I bounce back here, JFK is out in the middle of Jamaica Bay back then, and so there's just radically different things going on. And so this map in particular was where we probably spent a lot of time in the end. And one of the reasons is that what I was able to do to make this turned out to be the best case for making a lot of maps in the series. When I was first hired, they said, we'd like to do 2 or 3 more maps than that Boston map, and they'd be pretty happy if they could get that done. And then I ended up showing them, the basis for what became this map. And that within a week came back to say, well, yeah, we'd like to do as many maps as we can possibly get into the series. And that ultimately turned into about 100 maps. And so how I make these maps then became something I was sharing with them so they could see what happened and how this worked. And you can see on the right here, there's a scanned map that I've done something that we call georeferencing in GIS, which is to say, take the geography that's on the printed map and stretch it and rotate it so that it fits, as close as we can get to modern geography. And I've done this with maybe 60 or 70 maps that occurred throughout North America in the 18th century. I've also used a lot of manuscript journals and published sources that just named places, but did it with a way that gave me enough information to find the location and put it or into my GIS work. And the way we did this is that I would take a map like this, and then I would actually start sketching on top of this to get the coastline sketched in, and then I would look for the rivers and roads and everything else that was something that I could not only see in the original 18th century map, but also locate in today's geographies. Like some of the roads are actually still named the same. So when I would find an intersection of modern streets and colonial streets, I knew exactly how to say I have a location on both modern maps and colonial maps, and I can use that to fine tune the georeferencing process. This map in particular was kind of a little bit of a treasure that we found. There's only one copy of it in existence. It was a map that was commissioned by King George III that he had sent two surveyors from England to New York in 1780, and in 1781 they did all of this work to figure out everything that was in this territory. And this is the territory that the British Army controlled. And so they had full access. They knew where everything was, every farm, every stream, every road, every inn, and the shape of the coastline had more detail than any map that we had found. And that's the kind of thing we were looking for all over colonial America. And that allowed us to come up with something that we could justify as, this is the state of the landscape, including the shape of the coastline, which, New York's coastline has been modified quite a bit. This little hook down at the bottom part of Long Island, as you get towards Staten Island, is Coney Island, and back then it actually was an island. And so, getting these kind of things in there that explain the kind of roots of modern geography while having this kind of foundational basis to tell the story of the American Revolution made a big difference for us. So what that looked like when I was doing the work is that I would have this georeference version of a map, and I've got roads drawn on here, but they're just brown lines, so you can't see them very well. So I've got one example selected, and every feature in my database has information about it. In this case, it's a road. I knew the road was called the Jamaica Pass Road from actually a different source. And then I also would say, is it drawn from a modern source? In this case, I hadn't edited that field yet. But this source ID is something that points to what I call a spatial bibliography, which was a footprint of every map that, like this one, that I'd used to figure out what was actually known in colonial times versus what was known today or by the people living there. And I have a bibliographic information for every map, including a hyperlink to, in this case, it's a link to the Leventhal Library, which is Boston Public Library's map collection. And you can see this map online. And then while I'm editing all this, and here's a simpler view without the Taylor and Skinner map, which King George had commissioned. And instead, I'm looking at a map that was done about 10 years prior to that, and just seeing that this was the road to Jamaica. There's the town of Bedford, and if you've seen the film series, these locations are central to telling the story of how the Battle of Brooklyn played out. So, in order to produce these modern maps, and the video you're seeing here is actually a video clip from the movie, and this shows how Ken Burns uses the maps in his film. And the idea here is that it was a two-part process after I got done. And what happened is that I worked with the group called Flea TV, and it's a graphics design studio that does work for television and movies, and it's led by Molly Schwartz, who's their lead designer. And she came up with this look for all of the maps that appear, all the new maps that appear in the series. And what they would do is they would take my data and give it this look. So they didn't have to figure out where all the rivers were or where all the towns and cities and boundaries were, but they needed to essentially style them in a way that would make the map that appeared in the movie. They also did the designs for these flags that were showing ownership of forts in this case. And then those would all get handed off to Ken Burns's team. And in particular, Brian Lee was the design, what he called the motion designer for this, and he's the one that does the, what we've come to call Ken Burns effects, where I'll hit play again here, where we start out and Ken has his camera. So what they do is they lay this out on a kind of a digital table, and then they take a camera like a video or a movie camera and zoom in on the digital asset in this case. And they would highlight in this case, and we learned to do some different things with this. Like many of the movies in the map have arrows that draw as the narration goes along. In this case, we had highlighted the Shawnee and Delaware names so that when they happened during the narrative, people knew right where to look. And so we could link the maps to the narrative and the video in a very tight way that allowed everybody to follow without having to work very hard, and therefore hopefully learn what was going on based on the movie coming into their screens. So what all this ended up looking like in my case is that I have a geographic information system that has 15,000 features that cite some colonial feature. And I'm the only one until Ken Burns's team had come along that had my hands on and was working on this data. And so the way Ken Burns's team works is that they want to verify everything that appears in their film. They don't want to take a chance that something was in the film incorrectly, whether it's misspelled or I found cases where the graphics team added an extra town named after one of the graphic artists, and so at the end we would go through and call out and make sure nothing new, nothing wrong, everything that's supposed to be there is there. And we did that actually 3 separate passes for all 15,000 objects that appear in the films. And I worked with Grace Bartosh, who was a new hire onto the team, and her entire job was to track all of the things that we were figuring out. And to do that, I ended up making an online map for them to use. And I'm going to just switch over to show you what that looks like. So I've got a web browser open here that has an online map that I created for them. And I'm going to just zoom in a little bit so that what happens is they're able to zoom in on this map, and I'll go slow enough so you can see what happens as they zoom in is they'll see more and more places, more details come in, and eventually they'll click on a place and they want to see what the source was. They want to verify that every feature had a source as a map that was produced. In many cases, I would put a URL in that went to the Wikipedia site or the town historian's website that explained that this place did exist in colonial times and what its role in the revolution might have been, and essentially tie everything that people were seeing to this process. And we would even do this, and I'm going to zoom way in here for a moment just to show how much detail sometimes showed up. So this will crisp up and you can see the details of New York City. I have my own layer that shows the extents of all the battles that we know the locations for. So there's about 250 battles throughout the American Revolution. I took those either from maps that were published at the time, or there's the American Battlefield Trust that's also done a detailed inventory of many of the battles. And my work even goes into the level of detail that it even gets down to the names of the streets in New York City at the time. And this will take a moment to kind of crisp up the geography to the full level of detail here. But this was the kind of thing that they saw that was possible. So we knew we could create or have Molly create any location by seeing something like this. So she had everything that was necessary to come up with the kind of the simplest version in the film series that would help them tell the story. And I'll switch back to the presentation here. Oops. And here we go. And so this is something that I've now been transitioning into something that anybody can use, and this is all available online now. But in particular, we wanted to have this work out so that it could be used by educators and other historians to collaborate with me, or be able to add to, take what I've done and add to it. The idea is I've done the entire scope of colonial America, and let me jump back to this map one more time, because one of the things that was quite interesting about it is that we ended up using an application that was developed by my company, ESRI, for National Geographic's K through 12 education programs. And as we did this work, and I've zoomed way out here, and I'm probably one or two scales too far now. And here we go. So this is a good scale to look at once it finishes drawing. Is that as we were doing this work, one of the things we wanted to do was represent colonial America more like the British maps at the time had done, because the idea was that we wanted to show what colonial America looked like. And was understood, and how it was understood by the people who were living there at the time. And you start to see some of this. My internet's going a little bit slow for having Zoom and everything else working at the same time, but it's slowly drawing in all of the American Indian tribe names, the major settlements for not only colonial America but also the American Indians. I've gone back in and filled this in going westward, so that places in the Spanish Empire where they've either done their mission towns or their the various capitals that were showing up around the time of the American Revolution are also in here, like San Antonio and Santa Fe. All of these were places that were already in place as of the American Revolution. And what all of us, as we saw these maps for the first time, realized is that none of us had seen a map with everything on it. In the sense that the British favored British things and less about Spanish things. The Spanish maps at the time favored their empire's assets and things that would help their citizens do better. We wanted to show as complete of a history of what became the United States, and having everything on it, like in this map, allowed us to begin figuring that out. And we also were trying to tell a story that was not so deterministic, in the sense of we all know what happened now after the American Revolution, but one of the things that I always kind of harp on is this little spot here in western South Carolina. This was not part of the United States or the colonies at the time. It was Cherokee lands, and still Cherokee lands throughout. And so, like, how we represent boundaries and how I'm handing things over to future historians and educators is I wanted to make sure that the state of things in the Revolution was shown not by today's boundaries, but by the boundaries that colonial Americans knew. And another good example is New York actually didn't include the northeastern or the northwestern lands. These were the Northwest was owned by the Iroquois Confederacy. Northeast was part Iroquois, but it was part that was just not New York at the time, and it was, these lands were contested, and everybody's got opinions about what ought to be shown there, but the truth is it wasn't anything until after the war, and then boundaries in Vermont and other things just started showing up. So then let me wrap up here with here we go. The idea that all of this is online. I came up with some short URLs to give you the ability to, if you have any GIS background, you can use my ArcGIS online, and ArcGIS is the software that my company makes, and this is where I've hosted all of the resources. And then, or if you just want to explore the map I've been showing, that link is second here. And I'm happy to take any questions either now or via my email address here, which is kind of rooted in the combination of my books and this what I'm calling the geography of the American Revolution, which is the work that I ended up completing for Florentine Films as we did the work to produce the film series. So thank you very much. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to present all this, and happy to, if you have a few minutes to take any questions, and I'd like to hear from you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for the moment here, and just so I can see everything in Zoom.
Charlie, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah.
Anthony?
Can you hear me from back here?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I had a question about your historical map. I saw where you had stretched out to kind of fit the geography that we have today. And I kind of wanted to just ask, did you utilize that historical map as like a base layer, or was it a feature layer that you put on top of another base map? before you created your other feature layers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I did was wherever I could use an 18th century map where they, and there's a key distinction in 18th century mapping that occurs, which is they move from maps that are made using something called celestial navigation, which is the technique that sailors use to get from point A to point B. So like if you wanted to sail from London to the New World, you knew the rough coordinates of New York City, and you could use the stars to navigate. So and celestial navigation gave you about a plus or minus a quarter mile of accuracy. And to do the details of New York City, though, or Boston, that wasn't possible to take a celestial navigation-based map. And instead, modern survey techniques were actually being invented around this time. And so there were people who were the official cartographers for the king. And then there were also newly created in the 1770s, people who were the surveyors for the king. And both New Hampshire and New Jersey had surveys that had been made by Great Britain. So I could use those maps as they were, and I could line them up on modern geography, and they fit really well. And it was only the places that were kind of unknown in the sense of kind of relative distances that were not perfectly aligned. But the county boundaries for every incorporated county fit really well in all the surveyed maps.